Great. Well, thanks for having me out. So I'm with Pop Sandbox Productions, and we are a multimedia production and publishing company. So it actually fits quite well with what David was going into. Basically, our focus is production across platforms. So it's largely into graphic novel, film, new media, but they're conceived as basically that core story, and then they're intended to roll out across platforms. Our first release was this past year, but I have been working on it for quite some time. And I think the best way to probably explain exactly how we do, because it's really tied into the actual process, is that we're going to go through kind of a breakdown of the process. Starting with my own background, because that's kind of what's led me to the type of model of the company as I do it. The process then results, what worked and what didn't work, and then where I see the future for not only, I guess, my company, but for publishing. So starting with myself, so the background in business and film, I guess quickly speaking, I was that guy. I started working at a video store in high school. I always loved comics and film, and that was kind of my thing. I went into study business at college with the intention of getting into film producing. I moved on to Queens, where I studied film. There I ran a little rep cinema and started a film festival as the way of kind of getting into the film industry. And so it was all with a pretty strong vision in mind, with this ambitious goal of producing a film by the time I was 25, which I did, which was great, and initially seemed it was the best possible thing. We launched the film September 11th, 2001, which was the brutal date, but it was at the Toronto International Film Festival. We came out of the screening with a distributor interested, with a broadcast on board, and couldn't have been more happier, and then it disappeared. And basically, it was a film that dealt with sexual abuse, not understanding how distribution worked at the time. For the distributor, it was a broadcast buy. They were able to flip it quickly, make the quick money, and not really get behind it in a big way. And in the small push that it did get, a film that dealt with sexual abuse ended up marketed as a sexy thriller. So it was pretty much one of the most disheartening processes that I could have gone through, which made me want to figure out how that happens. And this all leads to kind of the model of what we do now, which was learning distribution. So I ended up starting with Mongrel Media. I joined them at the perfect time. They're an incredible company. I'd say that they're Canada's top independent and foreign film distributor. They handle Sony Picture Classics and a wealth of kind of social issue documentaries and independent feature films and foreign films. And in the time that I was with them, I joined, and I was the first person on home entertainment. At that point, there were 7 people in the company, and we were doing about 20 DVDs a year. And I was there for this great growth period in which by the time I left, we were doing about 80 branded DVDs a year, 120 overall, and there was 7 people now in my division and 23 in the company. And it just gave an incredible chance to learn how that works and how to avoid exactly what had happened with the feature film before. So it was really about learning both sides in order to be able to do what I'm doing now, which is a move into publishing. But I should stress that with the company, the way it's structured, the whole multimedia production and publishing approach, publishing is probably about 40% of what I do. I think about 60% really is I guess, transmedia producing or multimedia producing. So the move into publishing, it was something that I really wanted to do all along, was to basically learn the distribution and marketing piece in order to be able to go back and apply it to my own stories. But I guess where I'd always loved comics, film, even video games equally, I think when I made the move into film at that point 10 years ago, there wouldn't have been an audience for the types of stories that I'm interested in telling. Especially, for example, the feature I talked about, Walk Backwards. As a graphic novel, it would have been really hard to hit an audience at that time with a film that really was intended for a female audience when you had to go directly through the comic store. But that, of course, has changed, and now you've got Chapters Indigo, you've got Pages, Types, all these. Well, Pages not anymore, but this is not a reading series. You've got so many different outlets of being able to reach that audience, and as a medium, it kind of goes back to the 2 lessons that I had from that production, which was that film is an incredibly expensive medium, that in order for us to be able to tell the film the way we wanted to with the least compromise, it was all credit card funded, and we really couldn't get anyone on board without compromises that we weren't willing to make. And if it hadn't have sold out of the Toronto Film Festival, we'd still be paying credit card debt. So it's such an expensive medium, and it was, so I guess what I find the graphic novel medium allows for me is to be able to tell something as pure to vision as possible. And so that brings to the case study, which is KENK. So that was our first book. And it was conceived as a graphic novel from the get-go. But it was actually conceived as a graphic novel, an interactive piece, and a film simultaneously. We were trying to raise the funds for all at the same time. We ended up not having any funding on board for the book, so that was putting my money where my mouth is. That was my down payment for my house that went into starting the company. On the case of the interactive side, the CFC Media Lab, which are out of the building here, they came on and helped us with a stage 1 prototype. And the film, and that kind of speaks to the difficulty, is we hovered for about a year-long dance before getting ultimately a rejection from funding for it. But we were able to turn that around. So I guess we'll kind of go, and that's off of the film. So the process that we do, well, here's just another look at the book. I did leave sampler. I believe everyone's got a sampler, but if anyone didn't get one, I've got a bunch in my bag as well that I'm happy to give out. So it kind of follows the process from the get-go. So again, the approach I take is basically like a traditional film producer's approach, but to these cross-platform stories. In this case, it started with myself and Jason Gilmore, who's a filmmaker. We shot with this man, Igor KENK, for a year and a half, over which this period we collected about 30 hours of video footage. Also for the creation of the project, we got photos of him from his childhood, early stint when he did some modeling. We actually licensed some stuff from Yugoslavia, some award-winning photographs from Ron Haviv. We licensed all kinds of third-party media. And I guess, you know what, I should probably back up, because for the people who don't know who Igor KENK is or even what the story is, I'll just try to do my fastest summary. But he's kind of a notorious figure for anyone in Toronto would probably know him. For years, he was known as, he was kind of an urban legend. He was the boogeyman of stolen bicycles. If your bike was stolen, even the police would send you to his shop to go take a look for it. And what we ended up doing is kind of a portrait of this man, but also of the changing neighborhood, because the two are completely intertwined. To give context, he bought his building for $85,000 just over 10 years ago. By the time we were shooting with him, it was worth, he was getting offers of $600,000 to $700,000, and he wasn't selling. So whereas he didn't used to stand out, now you had his place amongst basically doggy outfitters and high-end boutiques and patisseries and Starbucks, and then you had his place where he had no store window. It was just entirely sheet metal, chalk-scrawled signs. It was so filled with bikes he had to spill them onto the sidewalk just to open at the start of the day. And he had this completely shady clientele till 2, 3 in the morning, usually most of the times. But the first time I actually went in, because I've lived in the neighborhood for 6 years now, and I'm kind of part of the change in the neighborhood. I came there because the film company that I went to move with was located there. But when I actually went and talked to him, it didn't add up. It was he surprised me as a character, because when you started talking to him, you know, his wife's a Juilliard graduate and one of Canada's top classical pianists, and he'd gone through the collapse of Yugoslavia. Prior to that, he was a police officer in Slovenia, and he had this whole zero consumption lifestyle where he would preach this kind of pure form of communism and radical environmentalism. He'd capture his shower water to feed his plants, and it was this complete eccentric who, all the same time, was acting capitalist in the most vicious sense, because the way his store worked was essentially a pawn shop where these bikes would come in, and he'd knowingly buy a $500 bike for $50 from a crackhead, completely knowing that it was stolen. But it got more complicated because the people that were buying it back was us. And so it became this kind of really kind of complicated piece in which his whole thing is that he would say it's not altogether that different than how we exploit the third world, and he'd have this kind of this circular logic in how he justified a lot of things. But as a character, I couldn't find anyone, I've never found anyone who's been more interesting and more open with it, but also it's kind of the story of this 10-year period. So it was conceived like you would a documentary film. It was shot like you would a documentary film, but with the intention of telling it as a graphic novel. So from this material, again, and that's kind of the approach of Pop Sandbox, is that the whole idea even of a sandbox is that it's kind of a creative environment where we're taking people from a variety of different disciplines and bringing them in as kind of these empowered roles. So whereas it started with myself and I was doing the early writing under the guidance of Russell Smith, actually, and we had Jason shooting, at one point Igor ended up becoming arrested, and it became this huge news story where the New York Times broke the story on page 6 and became a big piece. At that point, as it became more of a journalistic piece, I ended up stepping down and brought on Richard Poplack, because as it moved into more of a journalistic role, he was the first journalist who was really tackling the subject at a larger level. He did this great piece for Toronto Life, and shortly after we brought him on board. So the entire script was written similar to how an Alan Moore or Neil Gaiman would write it. It was all rooted into the actual material. Everything is meticulously transcribed and with detailed instructions. Then it was laid out by Jason, who is also the filmmaker, but he's also a designer. And then we get to the illustration style, and again, it's kind of these morphing projects, and that's where the producer's kind of driving it through as it evolves. But the illustration style ended up changing, and that was because we sent Rich to Slovenia to do background interviews with Igor's friends and family, and there he found this incredible art movement that was going on while Igor would have been there, which was all rooted in the photocopier, because it was all state-controlled printing presses, and the photocopier was this important agent of democracy. So in this case, we ended up bringing on Nick Marinkovic, who had a Serbian background and completely understood the style immediately. And we came up with this style that's kind of rooted right into the photocopier and informed by the subject matter and building this aesthetic. So we slowly pick up pieces as we go along. And then the interactive piece, now this didn't materialize the way we'd hoped it to. We ended up just doing more of a rich media preview, which was great as a marketing device, but not as an actual finished piece. But the idea was that to allow people to take the printed page and to expand it right into the original source material. So whereas the first panel we've got here, it's a photo of Igor as a child growing up. If you were to click that photo or swipe it, you'd be able to see, several photos of him and expand the narrative wherever you'd like to. Or in the second case, he's saying it was a difficult life. If you were to click on that, it would actually expand it into the video context. So the idea is it allows you to immerse it, but it's not forced interactivity, because I find interactivity for the sake of interactivity doesn't work. So now this kind of brings full circle into the film. So what I'm about to show you is just kind of a teaser that we have for the film, which, as I said, we did this year-long dance, and actually within weeks of the book coming out, we were able to then trigger the film, which is great. So we're into production onto it, but we did it with this piece. And this, the trailer, basically, it kind of, again, it's cross-platform, everyone feeding to the other. It actually served as a trailer for the book. So, and this is by Craig Small, who's an award-winning director who worked on, helped develop one of the looks behind Madame Tootly Pootly, which won it for the Oscar. And he works with The Juggernaut, which is one of Canada's top, or he's actually, creative director of The Juggernaut, one of Canada's top broadcast design firms. So hopefully the audio is okay.
I like to be underdog. It's idea. Bicycles are just my tool because they're so transparent. But my body is not corresponding with my brain. Back home, I was flushed with junk because we were poor. Here, I'm flushed with junk because people are ignorant. I must admit, I don't feel that sorry for people who have shit that's to be stolen. All I'm saying is, if you have something, like everybody wants to have something that looks stealable, and I go like, why would you want to do this? This is liability. Liability.
Actually ends with a city of Toronto like clock. It's kind of a tombstone above him, and the actual final image, which wasn't as clear, but it ties right back to the book to make the connection clear. So in this case, I guess the results of what worked, well, we couldn't be happier with how the book rolled out, but you also can't bank on your subjects being arrested, so it was kind of a weird anomaly. But it hit incredibly well. I mean, we ended up getting cover of Now, which was the first time for a graphic novel, and excerpted in the Globe and Mail, which was also the first time for a graphic novel, so that was incredibly exciting. I guess we couldn't have a better partner with Raincoast. We were able to move incredibly quick. I mean, we basically put the book to bed, and I guess this speaks to also being able to be producer and publisher, but the last image of the book was March 4th, I believe, March 6th actually, and then the day that it hit stores was start of May. So we were able to turn it incredibly quick, and I guess that's kind of the flexibility of doing both, but we really rolled it out and did very well. The first edition was fully placed almost out of the gate, and then we went back to second print shortly thereafter. So we're really happy with how it went. Again, as far as that whole cross-platform approach, it's interesting because the book ended up feeding into the film, and the film fed back into the book. And so in the end, you had a lot of events where we were going to things like, the International Documentary Festival of Amsterdam, which is the world's largest documentary festival, and talking kind of about both. And the same thing with the Ottawa Animation Festival, which is the largest in North America. So we were able to kind of really feed one into the other, which was fantastic, and got things really going. What didn't, well, it's not even necessarily stuff specific to KENK. I mean, there's a few different things. I mean, first, the interactive piece we weren't able to push ahead with. The film we weren't able to release, of course, simultaneously, both of them kind of budget restrictions, and a few challenges on that side. I guess there's other stuff that's just kind of at a broader level as far as for this model. It is difficult because it's so time consuming, of course, for each project. I mean, this one from start to finish was 3 years, although I was with Mongrel for a good portion while I was running it on the side. But yeah, it's tricky that way. And even went off to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and there's a lot of great books that I was very interested in potentially bringing over here, but they don't really fit this model. The model, what makes a Pop Sandbox project is the fact that it's produced all the way through, and the whole multidisciplinary approach. And so to that end, it would make it difficult to do a high volume onto that side, which is definitely a challenge. But I think, yeah, overall, we were incredibly happy. And I guess that kind of spreads a little bit into the future, which is kind of what our plans are. So this type of cross-platform storytelling, well, year one, it was very difficult to get the early support from funders into the production. But based on how things have done, we're now into the second year of production where all the projects are funded, which is great. And by the end of the year, I'm hoping that we'll qualify as a publisher for funding for like emerging funding and whatnot. And so that's kind of the 3-year arc of where I see things going on to that side. I mean, there's a few other things that spring to mind. I mean, on one side, the interactive graphic novel technology that we were working on. So we're now back deep into it. We've actually been brought into DocShift, has an incubator program, and so I'm knee deep in that. I'll have it done by June, kind of a sampling of how I see a fully enhanced graphic novel could work. And I guess one of the things, and it's just kind of a morph between the first iteration and the second iteration, is realizing that as beautiful it is for me to be able to expand into something like where I was showing with KENK into the childhood photos and all those things, I think that kind of technology probably lends itself more to evergreen titles than it does to necessarily my title. So I'm conceiving it as a technology that can go beyond it. But it's again one of those ones in that you need to have the technology in order to be able to tell the story. So kind of developing both simultaneously. That's moving along. As far as for projects, we're about to be launching the next day, which is going to be in May, and it's being conceived as both a graphic novel and then an interactive animated web documentary. Both are kind of pulling from neither's an adaptation of the other. They're both just pulling from the same root material, which is original interviews we did with 4 people who've attempted suicide and survived. And then what we've ended up doing is, in the case of the graphic novel, it's more of a linear with representational illustration of the specific 4 participants, and it's more of a set flow of the fragments, whereas what the interactive allows you to do is to essentially create your own path through the material, through the audio material, coupled with animations based on the illustrations of John Porcellino, who's the illustrator for the book. So in the end, they're both from the same world, but completely specific to their medium. And the interactive, it's being driven largely through the National Film Board, who's a co-producer on it, and it's part of the it's the first digital project of the calling card program, which is in association with TV Ontario. So we're very excited about that. I'm going to end with a trailer of it before any questions, but I guess other projects we're doing, we've got a photonovella that we're doing with Russell Smith, which is again cross-platform in one of these weird, hard to define ways, in that it'll be an original short story from Russell that's being adapted by Richard Poplack into the graphic novel form, and then shot by a photographer out of the Stephen Bulger Gallery using actors. So from a funding point of view, when you put that through, the literary grant section gives you to the film gives you to multi-arts gives you into arts, you really bounce around. But the end piece will be this beautiful book and potentially a music video, if that makes any sense. So, but we'll have more details on that as it comes. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just play the trailer for the next day, which is also in the sampler that we bounced around, and then I'd love to do any questions that anyone has. And I do talk fast, so I'm probably very early.
It can overtake you, it can overtake your mind and your body, and when you're feeling it, you just want it to go away. Because when you're feeling those emotions, you can't just wait. Like, you can't just wait till the next day.
So any questions, maybe? Oh, there we are. Thanks.
I'm just wondering how you envision yourself, let's say, putting you on the spot, like 5 years from now or something. Is this something like where artists come to you to collaborate, or how do you envision, it seems like, okay, it's a sandbox right now for
Yeah.
a couple of you, but how it's growing and how is it, is it something like where you're like a publisher and you accept ideas and you work with them along, or like, what's your vision?
Okay, yeah. Yes, I guess, yeah, the talk was, the question was about how we could see envisioning the growth for the project and I guess getting more people into the sandbox. So I think how I could see it going is in the case of KENK, where we had to really stagger the book and the interactive and the film, like things, it was more difficult to do it. I think as the company grows and the reputation grows, we'll have a higher ability to be able to go day and date with all the different elements. So I think that'll be one thing that switches, and we've been able to achieve that quite close with the next day. So the next day when it releases as the book, it'll release as the interactive piece will release really just weeks afterwards, which will actually give a nice second push to the book, and the book will do a nice lead in for the interactive. So. And then I think we're going to be day and date on both iterations for Russell's project. And I think how I see the actual company growing on that side, I mean, I definitely, we are limited in how many productions we can do given the model. But I think that the goal would be to be able to do larger projects across platform at the same time all the way through. And I think also one of the other things is that probably looking at potentially creating, I guess that's one of the things, it's Pop Sandbox, it's very specific. It's that whole multidisciplinary approach, and it really is, it's kind of, yeah, the original productions, and really what we're playing with is rooted in the graphic novel and kind of breaking the boundaries of the language, which is difficult, because even in Frankfurt there was some amazing books that just don't fit within that. So I think that it's entirely possible that we'll create some kind of second company that we can just do more traditional things through. So I think we'll continue to I think the volume of a Pop Sandbox will be 1 to 2 titles, and they're all kind of, as opposed to curated, it really is more like produced and edited, I guess, in literary terms. And so on that side, you know, we're looking at different collaborators for sure, but as we go, like there's a lot of people like Jason I've worked with, you know, since back to the Kingston Film Festival, and so there's pieces that we continue to work together with, absolutely. But then we're finding new collaborators that get it and really like the idea of I guess expanding things out there and open to kind of playing around a little bit. Oh, sure.
How do you do it? Do you commission a lot of the work, or do you have a royalty structure for all your artists that work with you?
Yeah, well, everyone, it's traditional advance against royalties for everybody. As far as whether it's funded in KENK's case, it was, like I said, just totally out of pocket. In future projects, it's like one aspect of the production can fund the others. So there's a ton of efficiencies in the case of doing the next day with the interactive with the NFB and TVO, and then also doing the book simultaneously. So there's some times where one kind of feeds the other until the book's ready, and then the book pulls the money to feed it back, and it's kind of there's a lot of efficiencies, I guess, in that way. But yeah, right now it's all kind of creative. I mean, sometimes there's funding, but we're kind of a nightmare for funding, because we like, as far as for public funding, because we don't fit within the traditional definitions of a lot of, you know, literary. Up until last year, for a writing grant, or for a graphic novel grant, it needed to be the same person that's writing and illustrating, which is already 20 years outdated, because that would preclude Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman, and so that's changed over the last year. But then if you bring a project like a photonovella to them, where there's no illustrator, it's a photographer, and there's actors, and there's an adapter, but the short story already exists, it becomes really tricky. So yeah, so we just forces us to get really creative. Yep.
Just wondering, given the fragmentation in the way you're putting your project together, how are you defining your target? How are you also fragmenting your consumers, or are you trying to get, I'm just wondering how you define that.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends. Like, there's some stuff which crosses over, and we've gone to the same well a little bit on some things, but then a lot of the time it's just specific to the project. So we had great success with KENK. And with the timing of the launch, which we're repeating for the next day, but it's by doing it that first week of May, you're hitting with Hot Docs, you're hitting with Flash in the Can, you're hitting with the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, where you're already getting 3 completely different demographics there that do cross over. And in this case, it's also Canadian Mental Health Week, so for the next day, it'll fit into there. So we definitely, like, it is specific to the project, so you're not reinventing the wheel each time. But I think in time, what I hope is that it'll also become a brand, and that's kind of what's happened. I mean, that's what attracted me to Mongrel. I mean, I first sent my first email about getting a job with them like 12 years ago, right out of school, and it was because when I booked that little rep cinema, I might not know what the film is, but I knew that if it was a Mongrel film, it was going to come with this much publicity support, this much marketing support, and it was going to be of this certain caliber. And so that's what I'm hoping that we can establish with Pop Sandbox. All right. I think we're behind them, but we're done. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.